Now that you have written your story, he said, now you have a responsibility to go and meet those whose lives you're impacting. When I was 21 and a half years old, addicted to heroin, stealing nearly every day to support my drug habit, broken life, broken family, broken dreams, somebody inconvenienced themselves to come and touch me. As I started to think that freedom was all about doing what I wanted, when I wanted, how I wanted, with who I wanted, I brought much destruction on my life and on all those around me. I learnt that the only place that success comes before work is in the dictionary, and that woulda, coulda, shoulda was not going to get you anywhere. But you see, when I was in year 8, the thing that really kept me safe initially from what my friends were doing was the fact that I had a dream that was so much bigger than the temptation sitting next to me. And a lot of my identity growing up was based on what I did. And when it was based on what I did, as I gave it up, I began to have this identity crisis. Who am I? Where do I belong? What's my life all about? Because in year 8, where the problem was just kind of a very small problem in my year group, by the time we got to year 9, that small problem grew, and by the time we got to year 10, that problem grew again. So much so that by year 10, it had become an acceptable culture in our year group to say that it was an okay thing to do. These people that were doing it and experimenting somehow had the greater voice in our year group to make it seem that taking drugs and alcohol was somehow so exciting that they gave us the impression, who weren't yet doing it, that unless we actually tried it, that somehow we were missing out. I believe that young people, you need to start to open your mouth and start to speak the truth of righteousness and values and morals, because there is a generation out there that is crying for direction and crying for the right voices to be heard. So we've been going. I can tell you, when your identity is based on what you do, the more that I actually kept doing wrong, the worse that I felt about myself. I started to drink alcohol and go to parties, and one thing led to another, and I started to smoke marijuana before a guy came into my life just before my 16th birthday who began to flatter me with all these words. And you see, when you don't really know who you are, you'll start to crave love from every other angle. I looked at him and I said, I don't know what I want for my life. He said, well, what will you do about it? And they addressed my life like this. She is a heroin addict. She's on methadone, a background of violence. And as I stood there, I thought, my life is just another statistic. That all these people that would stand before me and have their stories read, am I just as bad as them? My dad took 2 weeks off work because he refused to put me into any clinics because I kept hooking up with drug dealers in the clinics. So he said, that's it, we're going to take this time off, we're going to put you in the house, lock the house, ban the friends. And my father took me through detox for 2 weeks. I can tell you, when I got down to that program at 22 years old, my hair was falling out. My front teeth had now begun to rot over the years. I could hardly walk off that plane. I was vomiting. And if it was as easy for drug addicts just to say no to drugs, then our nation of Australia actually wouldn't have a problem. But once somebody gets addicted to drugs or addicted to other risky behaviours, there's actually a very long process that goes to breaking that stronghold over their life. My dad didn't know whether this program was going to work, but he pushed me away and he stopped and he broke down and cried and he looked at me and he said, don't come back to my family until you get your life back together. You know, whenever you're going through a crisis, the smartest thing you can do is actually find someone who has overcome what you were trying to overcome and sit down and ask them, how did you do it? That I started to have this picture of maybe I could speak to all these young people about the dangers of drugs. And it was motivated by a doctor who said, you will always be a drug addict. You'll always be a drug addict. He'd sign my methadone script and pop it in my hand and say, you'll always be a drug addict. We'll see you next month. And I would sit there and I just think, gosh, every time I leave there, that's what he speaks over my life. But in a time where I was actually looking at moving forward, rather than allow that person's words of limitation to impact me, I thought, you know, if there is a person I want to prove wrong, it's that doctor.